Welcome to the tutorial on writing present levels of performance. In this tutorial, we're going to talk about what this part of the IEP looks like and the components of it, and I'm going to give you some examples of the different sections written in detail. So let's first look at the purposes of the present level. We call it a present level of performance, but actually the official acronym, if you choose to pronounce it as such, is PLAP, which means present level of academic achievement and functional performance. Functional performance was added in the terminology to indicate that there are adaptive and social and other kinds of skills that schools should be working on in addition to those more academic subjects. So that's why those terms were added at the end. The purpose of this part of the IEP is it's a narrative portion of the IEP. It's meant to be a snapshot of what the student and his or her functioning in the school setting is at that point in time. And therefore it needs to be written pretty specifically, but concisely as well. So the writing of it is both an art and a science. The present level is usually one of the first places a new teacher will go to get an idea of what a student is about. So again, it is really important to write it well, given that team members, particularly those who are not familiar with a student, are going to be using it as a resource. The document should be written in a professional manner with positive wording. That doesn't mean that you need to candy coat things and not indicate that there is a problem, because obviously we're talking about the student's disability and how it manifests itself in the classroom. However, words like cannot and does not, those kinds of words are not really useful. My catch-all phrase that I like to use is has difficulty with. So again, we want to be professional, we want to be truthful, but we also want to be very careful that we word this positively when we write it. There are several sections to the present level, and they are bulleted here. The first section involves how the student's disability affects his or her involvement and progress in the general education setting. The second section is the strengths of the student. The third section is concerns of the parent. The fourth is student progress since the previous IEP. After that is a summary of the latest evaluation and reevaluation results. And the final section is a summary of the student's performance on age-appropriate transition assessments. And we're going to take each of these sections individually and talk about what exactly that means and what goes in each of those sections. So the first section is how the disability affects the student's performance. And within that section, here's some information that can be included. The student's age and grade and educational diagnosis might go in there. I said earlier that this is a part of the IEP where folks that are new to the student might come and look first. And so that information is nice to have in there. It actually is officially recorded on the first page, so it does go there. However, just to keep all the information together, it is nice to include that piece at the beginning. The second thing that might go into this section of the present level is any physical or sensory effects that the student's disability might have. If the student has physical impairments, then how those manifest themselves in the general education classroom would be discussed. And if there are sensory disabilities, like if the student has visual impairments or hearing impairments, obviously that is going in there as well. The rest of the pieces of information might look pretty familiar to you. It pretty much is what is in the macro bubbles that we've been doing all term. So you can talk about cognitive effects of the student's disability, particularly with regard to attention and memory and perception. Those would go into that section. Academic effects might go in that section. If there's specific academic trouble spots, for example, if the student has trouble reading or doing math computations or decoding or organizing information, writing sentences, all of those kinds of things would go in this section. You can also talk about academic performance being below grade level. So we have a 6th grader and his disability, his learning disability in reading comprehension affects his performance in the general ed setting in the sense that he's reading 3 grades below grade level, which is significantly different than the other kids in the class. You can talk about socio-emotional effects. This would manifest itself in behavioral or social difficulties. So if there's challenging behavior, what's going on? If there's social difficulties in terms of making and keeping friendships, any kind of social skills that are needed, you would address those here. And then language effects. Remember, we talked about the form and meaning and use of language, as well as comprehension and production of language. That gets into reading and writing and listening and speaking. So all of those effects go in that first section. Now, you might not necessarily need to address all of them, depending on the student's disability, but all of those topics are fair game to go in this section. So let's look at an example. This is Polly, and so what you can see, she's 13 years old and in 7th grade, and there's her diagnoses. And now we talk about how it affects her in the gen ed setting. So she has a language impairment, and it affects her in the areas of phonology. She has articulation issues. She has physical impairments, and picture someone who has cerebral palsy of some sort. She struggles with syntax and semantics, and it manifests itself in her speaking vocabulary and in comprehending spoken and written sentences that are more complex. Because she has physical disabilities, you can also see that second section there, managing personal items and traveling through the school environment. The next section involves the strengths of the student, and there's some things you need to keep in mind there. It should be related to the school environment. So we want to keep it to the school environment. However, just because we limit it to the school environment doesn't mean that we only have to address academics. We can go beyond academics. Think of what is addressed in specials in those kinds of classes. So you can address musical talent or dramatic talent, athletics, those kinds of things that would be found in your special kind of school subjects. It also must be related to what the student has control over. What I mean by that is occasionally I will see in IEPs that, Mikey is a very attractive child and has a great smile. Okay, well, that's fabulous, but that's related to his genes and what his mama and daddy gave him, not necessarily what he has control over. So that information is not really appropriate to put in there. Additionally, parents who are involved, while that might be a strength that helps the student, again, he or she does not have control over that, so that is not appropriate to put in that section. Must be related to the student, must be related to what the student has control over. You also need to keep in mind that strengths are relative to the student. So if you're dealing with a student with a more moderate or even severe disability who has difficulties across the board, then you might speak to the relative strengths that that student has. I'll give you an example. When I worked at Litzinger, I had students who had all kinds of cognitive and physical disabilities, and so they were working on things like eating and brushing their teeth and using the bathroom and whatnot. So while they had deficits across the board, maybe somebody would have a strength in mobility. Maybe he was learning how to walk and making great progress in learning how to walk. Now, compared to his other non-disabled peers, that was still a limitation of his. But if I compared the student to himself, his strength was in his mobility and the progress that he had made in that area. So you need to keep that in mind. Statements of strengths must also be qualified by examples of that strength as manifested in the school environment. So you can't just say, so-and-so has a strength in writing creatively. You need to tell me how that's seen in the environment. So Susie Q has a strength in writing creative stories. She often chooses to write as a part of her free time and often writes very creative stories about animals and fairies. So again, you need to give examples of how those strengths are manifested in the school environments. Okay. So here's some of Polly's strengths. A review of Polly's report card. She's completing curricular requirements and doing quite well in those. And she also has a strength in her ability to request assistance from school staff and peers as required in order to meet her personal needs. Concerns of the parent. One thing that we need to keep in mind in this section is that parents see the student in a much wider context than just school. They have them all day, they have them on the weekend, and they are looking long-term at what the student is going to be beyond graduation. So we need to keep that perspective in mind. The concerns, however, should be written to tie into the school environment as much as possible. So if a parent has a concern about maybe a student who has no friends outside of the school environment, okay, that's outside of the school environment, But a teacher could tie that back into the idea of maybe parents might be concerned with the student's ability to participate in extracurricular activities after school. That would therefore give them perhaps more friends after school. One also needs to keep in mind that parents sometimes need assistance in articulating these concerns in a thorough and professional manner. If you work for the different districts, lots of times there is a form that is sent to parents before the IEP that helps them to brainstorm through this section. Lots of times it's not returned, or if it is returned, it's returned and maybe written on, maybe there's a sentence. We want the student, we're concerned about the student's progress. The end. Sometimes, too, when you send that form home, you'll get a book written about all the concerns and all the problems that might exist in the school environment, and that document might be written in a very heated manner. It is the teacher's responsibility to help those parents who are a little less able to articulate their concerns to be able to pull that information out of them. And it is also the teacher's responsibility to help those parents who have a great deal of concerns, who might be angry at the school system, to be able to articulate their concerns, know that they've been heard, but to be able to write that section in an appropriate and professional manner. So this might involve some legwork on the part of the special ed teacher before the IEP happens. Here's an example. Polly's parents are pleased with her adjustment to middle school, but they want supports and assistance to enable her to participate in clubs after school for interpersonal relationships, and then technological devices to assist her in managing homework. Okay, this again has to do with the home environment, but you can see those tie-ins to the school, homework related to school, interpersonal relationships related to those after-school clubs. The next section is changes since the previous IEP, and this is actually the most technical section to write. What this involves is a systematic look at the goals and objectives from the previous IEP and a systematic reporting on them. To do this, these goals and objectives are reported on individually, and they must refer to specific baseline and instructional data. So you need reference to data before teaching began on this goal and objective, and then where the student is now. This is the part of the IEP that is most of the time, if you look kind of in schools now, this is a part of the IEP that is most likely to be written incorrectly. So again, it is the most technical. It's the data part. You need data to write this section. If you're not good at collecting data, then you're not going to have the data to back up kind of your comments about the student's improvement or lack thereof on the IEP goals and objectives. We're going to learn more about this in Methods 1, and you will definitely know how to do this. And you're going to see an example in a minute that will show you how this is mapped out. In addition, in this section, you can talk about other relevant changes that might have occurred since the previous IEP. If the student had surgery, if she had heart surgery and now is in recuperation, if there's noteworthy regressions, perhaps the student is exhibiting behavioral concerns now that are becoming more and more concerning. If there's health issues, seizures, those kinds of things, you can note that there. If this is the initial IEP, if you haven't written an IEP before on this student, this is the first one, then you need to state it. Since this is an initial IEP, changes will be reported on in the next annual IEP because you don't have any goals and objectives to report on yet, since this is the first one. This is a big, long example, but as you can see, these are the goals and objectives that Polly worked on related to reading, related to speech, and related to managing her personal items. And as you can see, they are reported on, and specifically with data pre and from and post. So data from the beginning of the school year, first semester, and then data in light of the first quarter, and then data in light of the last quarter of progress. So you can see those. This can be written in a number of ways depending on how data are collected, but this is a good start of an example of how this section should be written. The next section is the summary of the latest evaluation and reevaluation results. Do you remember, I hope you do, the evaluation and reevaluation cycle that we talked about? Remember the process that teachers undergo if they suspect a disability, they go to the care team, they try to do some things in class. If that doesn't work, then the student is assessed, and if he or she qualifies, then the IEP cycle is started. And then once the student is in special ed, the child has to be considered for a reevaluation at least every 3 years to examine whether that disability label still holds and if there's further information needed. So remember all that. This is what this section is about. First of all, if the reevaluation, if the 3-year eval is considered, but it's not going to be conducted because the disability, the label's fine, and we don't need any further information, then you're just going to note this in the section. On April 28th of 2011, the IEP team considered reevaluation and decided that the diagnosis was appropriate and no further information was needed at this time. The end. Okay? If an evaluation or reevaluation is conducted, remember, this is a summary. At the end of an eval or a re-eval, there is a very detailed report that is put out. It's several pages long, and it goes in the student's file. So we don't need this to be a huge, gigantic process. However, it should include the tests that are given and then the student's performance. Now, because this is a document that is circulated among many professionals, we want to be really careful about whether we're reporting exact scores, particularly IQ scores. That's very sensitive information. There is no legal reason or mandate that exact scores should not be used. You can use them. You can use them when there is good reason to do so. But for the most part, one should try to report scores in terms of performance in relation to other peers and relative strengths and weaknesses of the students, and not the exact score, because again, it's looked at by a variety of people, and that is sensitive information. I'm going to show you the example about how that works. Okay, so she was, her reevaluation was conducted on that date. She was given the WISC-3, which is an IQ test, and you can see verbal performance and full scale scores falling into the average range. So we're not given scores, we're just kind of given the average. She showed a relative strength in performance. Okay, and then we have the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scale. That's kind of a functional assessment, an assessment of functional skills. It was administered. Now we're talking about relative strengths, strengths in socialization, that subtest, but deficits in daily living skills, communication, and motor skills. That gives you an idea of how she's functioning. It's not giving you the exact scores. Again, if you need to use the exact scores for whatever reason, you can, but if there's a way you don't have to, that's the better way to go. All right, then the final section is a summary of the student's performance on transition assessments. Transition assessments means MAP testing, any other kind of state and district testing that the whole school participates in, or in the case of high school, the end of course evaluations that are given. You're going to report on the assessments that were given, whether the student took the assessment with or without accommodations. There's an accommodation page at the back of the IEP that talks about what accommodations the student will be given for state and district-wide testing. So you don't need to list the accommodations, you just need to say whether the student took the assessment with or without accommodations. You also report whether the student took MAP-A. MAP-A is reserved for those students with very significant disabilities that are not capable of participating in MAP, even with accommodations. When you look at the numbers, it's about 2% of the population. Most students take MAP with accommodations. There's a few students who take MAP-A, and you'll probably run into them at some point. But for the most part, students are taking MAP. If the student took the assessment but the scores are not available, which sometimes happens, you note this. Student took this section of the MAP in, spring of 11. Scores are not currently available. If there's not assessments administered for the student's grade or age, so the MAP isn't administered at this time, or end of course it's not administered, or we don't do I would test the basic skill testing in this grade level, you note that too. There are currently not assessments administered for the student's age and grade. Here's an example. So Polly's participated in MAP testing with accommodations in the area of math in spring of 2010, and then those are the results. She's scoring in the proficient range. That's how those scores are reported in terms of proficient or basic, below basic, those levels. She also participated in Iowa Test of Basic Skills with accommodations in spring 09. Her scores show relative strengths, again, not exact scores we're reporting here, mathematics and core subject area knowledge, and then there's her weaknesses. So those are how those scores are reported. Again, if you want to report scores, okay. If there's a way you can do it without exact scores, that's the way to go as well. So we've worked you through the present level. We're going to do some more examples with it in class, but this should give you enough of a foundation in it that we should be able to zip right along when we next meet. So thank you for listening.